The void between realities tore like damp parchment, not with the greasy bleed of demonic ingress, not with the reek of copper and sin that usually accompanied a warp screen, but with a sterile brilliance that made Auspex runes wash out and Pictfeeds strobe into snow. The wound opened at the rim of the Ultima Segmentum, a clean-edged crack against the smothered night, and every gun servitor along the spine of the battle barge Dominus Lux froze mid-ratchet, as if the machine god himself had held their cogs. On the observation deck, Captain Tavares of the Ultramarines' 4th Company stood statue still beneath vaulted adamantium ribs. His helm was locked, his stance loose, one gauntleted hand resting on the pommel of a power sword older than most worlds. For a long breath he said nothing, not when the navigator wailed 2 decks below, as the Geller fields flexed against currents that clawed the skin of reality, not when the starboard Auspex arrays pealed their warning chimes as if singing a funeral litany for a son. Energy readings are unprecedented, my lord, crackled Dominus Vex, the ship's tech priest, every third word segmented by the insect chatter of cogitators. Machine spirits cannot categorize the waveform, not warp tide, not Xenos emissions, other. A trio of black-hulled inquisitorial cutters slid into a geodesic perimeter with the efficiency of a closing fist. Blast shutters on their flanks snapped down over purity seals. Vox bands hissed with kill phrases and interdiction rites. The Ordo Xenos was not a subtle institution. Tavares didn't turn, maintain the Geller hymn, triple word the bays. Nothing passes our teeth without my leave. The wound in the dark pulsed. The navigator screamed again, a sound like glass pulled across bone, and for a moment the tides of the warp and the hard angles of real space kissed, wrongly, intimately, in a manner no archivist had ever recorded. Servitors on the observation deck clattered back against their rails, optic lenses dilating to full. Then the light collapsed into itself. For half a heartbeat there was nothing. No glare, no sound, only the cold void, black and pitiless. Auspex returns flatlined. Vox links crackled. Someone somewhere began the litany against unreason. Contact, said the Auspex officer, voice too steady to be entirely human. Single return, short range, within our outer hangar lattice, alive. Dominus Vex's mechadendrites shivered. Impossible, how impossible? Tavares asked. Alive within a sealed void lattice, without a registered translation vector, Vex replied. No teleport flare. No boarding glyph, no drop signature, arrival without event. That was new, and new in the Imperium was rarely good. Bring it in, Tavares said. Maximal containment. Inquisitorial channels live. If it breathes, it answers. Bells tolled within the Dominus Lux as rites of interdiction marched through maintenance galleries and nave-like corridors. The hangar's external lattice, an emergency pressure sleeve for void operations, flexed to cradle the anomaly. Thousands of purity seals whispered against one another, like dead leaves. Vulcan iron doors stirred gears whispering benedictions. And somewhere, beyond sight, the ship's ancient heart prayed to engines older than memory to hold fast against what was coming. It arrived as a shape within the hangar's sealed bubble, not a dragon of iron, not a daemon of brass. A figure, compact, 2-meter silhouette, hunched slightly, as if ready to spring. Armor. No, not proper armor. Light plates, a shell-like carapace over shoulders and chest, a harness of pouches and magnetized tools. In one 3-fingered hand, a bow staff across the back, a pack of cobbled-together devices that whispered static to nearby Auspex in a not-quite-Heretic lullaby. Visual, murmured the Auspex officer. Humanoid, non-standard phenotype, dermal tint, green, a beat, cranial bandana, purple. The Pictfeed steadied enough to show a face that was not a face at all as the Imperium reckoned such things. A turtle's beak softened into something almost mammalian, eyes sharp beneath a strip of violet cloth. The thing took in the miles-long bay in a single sweep, head tilting, body loose. Its staff touched once to the deck within the bubble, testing, noticing how the lattice flexed back, a ghost of a smile, or the suggestion of one. Inquisitorial cutters request authority to lead containment, a bridge serf reported. Granted, Tavares said, but my guns stay up. The bubble arised open in a whispering spiral. Pressure equalized with a gust that fluttered seals and sent drifting incense smoke into new vortices. An inner ring of void shields hummed into life. A double cordon of ultramarines took positions, 10 to a side, bolters up, rebreathers hissing, helms a line of impassive skulls in cobalt and gold. Behind them, an inquisitor strode into view, ornate armor gleaming like oil on water, robed attendants flanking him like carrion birds. "Identify yourself," thundered Tavarus's vox, magnified to fill the hangar like a chapel bell. "You stand within Imperial space. You will submit to the will of the Emperor." The figure raised his free hand, open, fingers spread to show no weapon, but didn't cower. When he spoke, the voice carried cleanly through the hangar pickups, crisp, curious, very alive. "Name's Donatello," he said. "I didn't mean to drop in. Long story short, I'm lost. This isn't where I was 5 minutes ago." Dominus Vex's mechadendrites writhed, sniffing signals none but he could hear. Speech cadences consistent with low Gothic, but phonemes are playful. Non-standard morphology. Internal architecture reads efficient. His voice turned reverent and hungry at once. Anatomy of purpose. The Inquisitor stepped forward until the gold of his chest seal kissed the inner line of Tavarus's shadow. "I am Inquisitor Draven Karus, Ordu Xenos," he said, each syllable polished on steel. "You entered through an anomaly unlike any recorded since the heresy. You will be taken to interrogation. You will be catalogued, measured, examined, and judged. Resist, and you will die." Donatello's eyes flicked from the Inquisitor to the tech priest to the marine lines beyond. He took a breath through his nose, slow. The staff tilted an unapologetic millimeter, back into the crook of his elbow. "I'm unarmed," he said, then made a tiny face at his own lie, and added, "Mostly, I'll cooperate. Just, maybe we could start with hello, and not vivisection." Somewhere in the belly of the ship, as if in answer, the warp pressed a palm against reality. The Psyker, in robes at the Inquisitor's rear, flinched and clutched her temples. "Captain," she whispered, eyes focusing on something no one else could see. "The currents stir, a note in the song that does not belong. It hungers. Secure him," Tavarus said. "No harm unless he earns it." The containment procession moved with mechanized choreography. Servitors in chain veils trundled forward, bearing hexagrammatic stanchions that hummed with old void shields nested like petals. A grav sled floated, restraints padded and printed with litanies in copper. Donatello watched it all, gaze snagging on each piece of kit with unmistakable professional interest. He looked, Tavarus thought, not unlike a tech marine, confronted with a pattern he had never seen, hungry for understanding, hands itching. "Question," Donatello said as 2 ultramarines stepped in. "These Geller fields you keep referencing, are they vector stabilizing against, call it malicious probability? Because your harmonics are off, like 2 Hz flat on the 3rd harmonic." Dominus Vex turned his head with the slow grace of an old turret. "You perceive the song of the Geller. I hear the hum of a lot of things," Donatello said. "Yours sounds tired." Karus's hand settled on his bolt pistol. "No more words." Tavarus lifted 2 fingers. The Inquisitor, after a heartbeat-long duel of glares, let his hand fall. "Walk," Tavarus told the outsider. Donatello walked. They moved through the nave arteries of the Dominus Lux, like a procession of relic bearers. Servo skulls flitted overhead to record. Saints' bones in glass reliquaries watched with blind sockets as the column passed. The outsider didn't go. He stared, quick, sharp looks, at cogitator interfaces, at the way cables fed sanctified wards, at the telltale chalk marks of a tech adept with poor penmanship, who'd patched a lumen string 1 too many times. He was cataloging. "Curiosity," Dominus Vex murmured through a private channel, "is a blade with 2 edges. Everything in this galaxy is a blade," Tavarus said. They reached the containment sanctum, a cathedral of machinery, layered void shield petals, nested within hexagrammatic inlays, graviton nets whining like wasps behind the walls. The floor was adamantium, inlaid with obsidian sigils. The air tasted of incense and cordite. Inside, Tavares said. Donatello stepped into the heart of the wards and stopped on the sigil's eye. The petals hissed closed. A shimmer rose as shields bit and layered. Vitals, Chorus asked. Stable, a medsurf intoned. Non-human biochemistry. Cell walls polymerized. No natural composite. Fascinating. Stop worshipping it, said Chorus, and the medsurf bowed so low his vox bead clicked against his collar. Tavares stepped forward until his helm's vox grill kissed the edge of the shield petal. You said lost, he said. From where? Donatello pressed his lips together, then shrugged with one shock. Another world, another set of rules. He searched for a word and found none. I don't know how I punched through to you. 1 second I'm in a lab with my... He stopped himself, with a team. The next there's a rip and a light, like a welding arc the size of a city. And now I'm here. I didn't bring anything through on purpose. I didn't come to hurt anyone. Chorus's gaze sharpened at team. Names, coordinates. Not yet, Donatello said gently. I don't know who you are. I do know you killed your navigator for seeing something he shouldn't have. He tipped his head toward the psyker. I'm guessing you'll do worse for a stranger. The woman's eyes tracked 1,000 meters inward. Captain, she whispered. The warp leans. Something far from ourselves has looked our way. Tavares's hand tightened on his sword. How far? Across the sea of soap and beyond, she said, voice falling into ritual despite herself. But here now, as if a storm had smelled a spark. In the far distance, claxons roared like thunder, not the steady warble of a drill. A voice rose on the vox, tinny with interference, and found them all beneath their armor and augmetics and iron. Bridge to all decks, it said. Unscheduled ripples along the outer hull. Warp pressure rising. Gela chorus compensating. A beat, then honest fright. Captain, we are not alone. Tavares raised his palm to still the Inquisitor's reply. He watched the outsider in the light of the sanctum. Donatello's weight had shifted. He had leaned a fraction forward, not toward the Marines, but toward the bulkheads, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. What do you hear? Tavares asked. Donatello blinked. You'll think it's nonsense. Try me. A hunting chorus. 4 voices. No, 4 harmonics pretending to be voices. Donatello said slowly, the words coming as he reached after them. They're not music, they're appetites with rhythm. The psyker made a warding sign that wasn't in any liturgy, just the shaking memory of an old prayer. Chorus's mouth thinned. Maximum alert, Tavares said, turning away at last. All companies to ready state. Inquisitor, you have your specimen. I have a ship to hold. The hangar bells answered, and the long dread hymn of battle rose through the decks. Beyond the sanctum's petals, Donatello tightened his grip on his staff until the wood creaked around the steel. Not a great first 5 minutes, he muttered, mostly to himself. Let's not make the next 5 worse. The ship listened to the warp and waited to be devoured. In the maddened skein of the Imperium, something vast sniffed the new scent and smiled a mouthless smile. Blood boiled in brass, parchment burned and rewrote itself in 1,000 tongues. Rock blooms shivered into new geometries of decay, and silk-soft hunger tasted a novel shade of fear. 4 hungers, 4 harmonics, pulling taut upon a galaxy's pain. The newcomer was not a star falling. It was a pattern, and patterns could be cooked. The containment sanctum breathed like a sleeping cathedral. Incense curled in slow, laminar sheets above the hexagrammatic inlays. Servo skulls hummed their little litanies as they orbited. Every 90 seconds a cherub drone dipped to daub oil across a wall and whisper a maintenance prayer through stitched lips. The hum of nested void shields set a subsonic beat that tickled teeth. Donatello stood at the center of it all, with his staff planted lightly against adamantium, etched in sigils he did not understand.
Light from lumen sensors slipped across the smooth planes of his shell. He had counted 12 different redundant restraint systems in the sanctum within the first 30 seconds. Grav tethers, hexaglyphs cut by hands that had meant every stroke, field petals with fail-safes and fail-safes, even a gravity gradient that would tilt to throw him to the deck if someone said the wrong word. The mechanisms weren't just designed to hold bodies. They were meant to hold ideas that had learned to wear bodies. He didn't test any of them. Through the petals shimmer, Captain Tavares and his tactical squad spread in a crescent, bolters down but ready. Beyond them, Inquisitor Draven Karas stood like a statue carved for intimidation. Robed attendants massed behind him. The Psycho woman with her 1,000-yard stare, a parchment-skinned scribe whose servo quills were already scratching, and a hooded adepts cluster that smelled of oil and ozone and old books. "Begin," Karas said, and the scribe bowed, reading from a ribbon of vellum that unwrote protocol. Ordo Xenos interrogation primer, minor entity, category unknown, query string 1, identity confirm. "I told you," Donatello said. He kept his tone polite, maybe even light, because you could sand a hard exchange into something survivable with the right edge. "Donatello, call me Don. Species classification," the scribe continued as if a green biped with a staff were a formality in a bad dream. Don looked down at himself, then back up. "Mutant terrapin if you want to be literal. Humanoid, fully sapient, trained." The Psyker's gaze flicked over him. "His mind is quiet," she whispered, frowning, as if at a problem that would not line up. "Not like a void's howl, but quiet as in ordered, layers that do not leak." Dominus Vex rolled forward 2 meters, chain tendrils adjusting some dial only he saw. "Define trained, combat, technologia, right work, ninjutsu, engineering," Don said. "Reverse engineering, if I'm honest." He hesitated, then added, "I build things that shouldn't work and make them work anyway." Karas's mouth made a thin crescent. "Heresy, by any other name, is still heresy. Where I come from, we call it Tuesday," Don said before he could stop himself. He winced at his own mouth and caught Tavares's helm tilt, a motion that might have been amusement if the Ultramarine had ever let that into his voice. "Purpose of incursion," the scribe intoned. "It wasn't an incursion," Don said. "It was a misfire, a rupture. I was working with energy I only mostly understood. I'm not proud of the mostly. Now I'm here. You have my word. I didn't come to scout, betray, plant a plague, or..." He glanced at the Psyker. "Whisper to whatever you think lives behind your walls." "Everything whispers," the Psyker murmured. "Even rocks, especially rocks, given enough time." "Your physiology," Vex said, and there was an ache in it. "Show me." Don blinked. "Oh, what part?" The mech priest's mechadendrites separated like curious fingers. "Dermal composition, skeletal arrangement, muscular cords, the architecture of your lungs, the efficiency of your heart, the ladder of your code, the way you fold." Don considered the ring of bolters. "How about I keep folding over here?" Karas lifted one hand. An acolyte hurried up with a tray. Monomolecular needles in sanctified glass, a vial etched with catechism, a handheld Auspex, whose sigils glowed with restrained hunger. "We will take a sample." Don held up both hands. "You're the one with the guns. I don't do well with needles." "Good," Karas said. "We do not ask your preferences." Tavares turned his helm just enough. "Inquisitor," he said, polite as a blade. "Our fields are tuned to contain demons. If you antagonize a being we do not understand, and it reacts, it will be my men who bleed first, and it will be you who disobey the Inquisition. If you stay my hand," Karas said without heat. Dominus Vex interjected, without looking away from his data. "A single cell will teach us more than 1,000 questions." Don sighed. "One swab," he said. "Skin only. No drilling. And I need to see your chain of custody, because if you pour it into something that bites the ship, I'm going to feel real bad for not stopping you." Karas flicked 2 fingers. The acolyte approached the pedal's edge. A slot rised open, no larger than a coin, sanctified steel, kissing the shield with a squeal. Don leaned in, offered the top of his hand, and tried not to flinch as the sword brushed. The acolyte withdrew like a fisherman who'd just pulled up a god's eyelash and didn't want to drop it. Chain of custody, Don said. The acolyte trembled, then passed the vial to Vex, who stamped it with a cock-tooth sigil and slid it into a warded reliquary that clicked shut, like a satisfied jaw. Custody, recorded. File line, Dominus Lux, Logis Red 27. The psyker pressed her palm to her brow and hissed between her teeth. Captain, she said, the tides are rising. A tremor rolled through the deck, subtle enough that a normal man might have caught at nerves. Suits and servo housings felt it like a breath on the skin. The sanctum's wards shivered. Incense smoke rippled in concentric rings. Tavaris's vox clicked to life. Bridge came a voice forced into calm. Micro-fractures across Auspex Dome 8. Geller chorus compensating. Chant cadence adjusting. Keep singing, Tavaris said. All companies, watch lines, do not fire at ghosts. The Inquisitor didn't look away from Don. You said your technology, he tasted the word like a slur, uses rules different than ours. Explain your arrival in language worthy of adults. Don licked his lips. He could give them a real answer. He could talk about harmonics and energy stacking, about tuned interference patterns and constructive resonance, about using a cheap scrounged component because the right one wasn't on the bench, about thinking he had it, about the smooth slip into failure. But the psyker's gaze was a weight, and the ship itself hummed with strain, and somewhere just beyond the deck, and the walls, and the rights there was a pressure like a hand settling on the back of his neck, curious and hungry. I was trying to look without touching, he said. Something touched back. The psyker made a small strangled noise. Karis's eyes flashed. What did you invite? The Inquisitor demanded. Name it. I didn't invite anything. Don shot back, sharper than he intended. He took a breath and shaved the edge off his tone. I'm telling you what I felt. Somebody's eyes. 4 somebodies. All one somebody with 4 very bad habits. Captain, the psyker said, tiny and far away. It is closer. Don's staff moved a hair, almost of its own will, to touch the sigil at his feet. The wood hummed with the ward line. He felt the field song through his calluses, a 2-flat 3rd harmonic, a tired 5th. He glanced at the tech priest, then at the generator stack that anchored the pedals. He spotted the Y in a heartbeat, a stress crack along a relay, hairline, just enough to tug the frequency down under strain. Your 3rd is drifting, he said. There, on the relay. See the shimmer? You need to bring it up. Now. Dominus Vex's mechadendrites went still. Then 4 snapped like striking eels. 2 to the relay, 1 to a cogitator that coughed incense, 1 to a manual wheel. Adjusting, he said, and for the first time something not unlike respect colored his tone. The pitch rose a hair. The ward line under Donatello's staff smoothed to a clean hum. The deck shuddered more honestly. Voxes snarled to life. Unscheduled mass on airlock 6 no 12. All airlocks. Breach pressures rising. Captain, they're testing us. In the sanctum, bolters came up as if pulled by the same string. Tavaris took a single step forward, and with the ease of a man who had spent a century making lunatics obey, put his body between the unknown and the crisis. Inquisitor, he said, voice calm as a knife point. You have enough for a chapter of sermons. Stand your dogs down and let me hold my ship. Karis stared at him for the space of a pulse. Then he flipped his fingers. The acolytes backed a pace, half disappointment, half relief. Tavaris turned his helm back toward the pedals. If you can make a ward sing true by naming a note, he said to Don. Do it again if we miss one. Noted, Don said, swallowing. They waited. Waiting was sound, waiting was smell, waiting was incense and oil, and the dry tick of servo quills, and the faint percussion of distant boots. It was also the whisper of a woman who did not entirely live in her own skull. It is not a ship, the psyker breathed. It is teeth. Karis laid 2 fingers against the devotional plate at his throat. It was not prayer, it was habit. Bridge, Tavaris said, report. Warp tides just the outer skin, the reply came. Galactic is holding at 96%. Chant leaders failing in Doom 2. Core Master ruptured his third eye. Request permission to. Denied. Tavares said. Rotate chant lead. Keep the song. Another tremor. Stronger. A very old pipe somewhere groomed. Don felt the wards hum keep time with the stress. Not random. Not like a storm at sea. Pulsed. He closed his eyes. He'd done this with engines, with the cheap generators in a city that hated him, with the ductwork over an alley where a pizza oven would backdraft if you didn't listen. It wasn't a storm. It was someone tapping the glass. He opened his eyes. You've got a pattern, he said. A test. Pressure. Retreat. Pressure. Probing for a harmonic that gives. If you keep compensating in a straight line, you'll put the Geller chorus right where they want it. Dominus Vex made a noise like a cupboard of tin cups falling. How do you know this? Because where I'm from, anything with teeth learns to taste for weak points. Don said, doesn't matter if it's a robot with an axe or a 6-year-old with a straw stuck in your milkshake. You don't push against a pusher in a straight line. You sidestep. Translate, Tavares said. Don't chase their pressure, Don said. He pointed, with 2 fingers, slow, to avoid spooking a gun line at the chant relays. Shift the 3rd and 5th ahead of the wave. Change your cadence as if you were late, before you are. Make them miss the window they're aiming for. Dominus Vex stared through half a dozen lenses, then, with reluctant joy, began to move. Rephasing, he said, his tendrils danced. The sanctum's hum changed in a way most ears would not have caught. Don smiled despite himself. The hum felt clean now, not because it was louder, but because it was awake. The deck shuddered again. This time the shudder rolled off the hull like a bad intention hitting a better plan. The psyker gasped. They noticed. Let them, Tavares said. For a heartbeat. 2, 3. The ship held. Don let himself breathe. He'd forgotten to do that. Congratulations, Kara said. And if there was praise in it, it had teeth. You delayed the inevitable by seconds. Seconds matter, Don said. Ask a surgeon, or a sapper. The Inquisitor's mouth twitched, perhaps amused despite himself that the green thing could say something that belonged to his own youth. Captain, the Vox snapped, and all amusement burned away. Unscheduled translation scars on the port flank. Borders, the sanctum changed like a living thing. Sigils brightened, field petals sang. Bolters clicked from ready to promise. A distant bulkhead screamed as its seals engaged a fraction too late, and the air tried to be elsewhere. Over everything, the Geller chorus raised their hymn, and blurred as they sang. Tavares didn't look at Don again. He didn't need to. He made a decision. No Inquisitor would praise him for, and every line Marine under him would die for. Hold your position, he told his squad. Inquisitor, you will not move the specimen without my consent. He turned his head a millimeter. If we live through the next 10 minutes, we can resume calling each other heretic and traitor. Karas's eyes were flint. He inclined his head the width of a coin. For 10 minutes, Don swallowed, flexed his fingers on the staff, and listened to the ship breathe. He was not in a sewer with graffiti and steam. He was in a cathedral built to sail a nightmare ocean, and outside its walls something with too many hands was feeling for the lock. He had come through an accident. He had not come to be a weapon. He had also not come to watch 1,000 people die, because he wanted to keep his hands clean. Captain, he said. Tavares' helm tilted a fraction. Speak, if your ward petals drop under load. Don said, the 3rd relay will blow first. I can keep it from cascading. If you let me out there with your tech priest. Kara snapped. Denied. Tavares said, granted, in the same breath. They stared at each other across a religion's worth of difference. The psyker made a sound like a laugh, and a sob tangled together. Dominus Vex's mechadendrites lifted with involuntary eagerness, like a scholar who had just been told he could touch the forbidden book if he kept one hand behind his back. Donatello spun his staff once, not for show, to feel its balance, to remind himself of the 1,000 hours that made a movement into a habit strong enough to shape fear. He touched the petal with the staff's tip. The ward hummed a question. Open, Tavares said. The petal aroused, and He stepped through into a line of bolters that did not like him, and a world that did not know him, and a world that did not intend to ask his permission. Somewhere on the port flank, something knocked on the door with a fist the size of a car, and the Dominus Lux answered with a hymn that tried to be louder than teeth. The first hit didn't sound like metal yielding. It sounded like a choir inhaling at once. Bulkheads bowed, rivets sang. The Dominus Lux flexed against its own bones as something outside learned the rhythm of its shields and pressed in time with the hymn. Voxes stuttered with overlapping orders. Seal, sanctify, redeploy, and then the word that redefined corridors and lifts borders. Hold this sanctum, Captain, Tavares ordered. Brother Sergeant, with me. The petals around Donatello hissed wider at a word from Dominus Vex. The tech priest's mechadendrites were already in motion, clamping fresh relays onto hot bus bars, turning sanctified dials that shrieked complaint before submitting. Don slipped out into the cordon. Staff low, chin up. You stay with me, Vex said without looking at him. You lay flesh on a glyph out of sequence. You will be paced and I will be embarrassed. Noted, Don said. He glanced down the nave. Lumen banks stroked warning red over a far bulkhead. The air had the taut, stretched feel of a room waiting to be vacuumed. Where? Vex jerked a chin toward the spine corridor. Port flank, access grid 12. They pry, we sing. The squad moved like a machine. Ultramarines peeled off in pairs to cover intersections. Bolters held at sternum height. Selector runes at Kraken. Cherub drone incense turned to bitter smoke as emergency shutters slammed down. The ship groaned again, a grating, intimate sound. Don felt it in his teeth. At grid 12, the world narrowed to a door ringed by gunmetal prayers. The inlaid hexagram kindled a tired glow. Oily iridescence crawled across its surface, as if the metal were remembering how to bend. Pressure spike, Vex hissed, chant lead, now.
Somewhere aft, a choir bled louder. The glow steadied, bolts shrieked, the ring dented inward, then outward, then inward in a rhythm that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with malice. A scene blossomed along a weld like a smiling mouth. Through the mouth came a scent like hot pennies and burnt parchment. Contact, said Brother Sergeant Maro. Sights up. The door ruptured in a blossom of screaming metal. The first through wasn't a man. It was a bloodletter, 8 feet of red, all edges and hate. Its blade, black and thirsty, smoked where it touched on air. It shrieked a word that didn't belong in throats. Bolters thundered. Mass reactive shells bloomed inside demonic flesh. Red steam turned to ash. The second bloodletter used the first as a shield and leapt. A power fist caught it mid-air and taught it about momentum and walls. More came, crimson shapes wriggling into reality on the back of others' deaths. Behind them, something like a knight in a cathedral of sin. A chaos terminator in corrupted ceramite, blue paint desecrated by brass runes, twin-linked bolter already spitting hell. Back 2 steps, Tavares said, voice flat. The line obeyed. Crossfire. Don didn't go forward. He went up. A rung ladder, half hidden behind a census chain, took him onto a grated gantry over the corridor mouth. He kept low, staff in both hands, counting the beat of bolter bursts below and the stutter of the enemy's heavy weapon. The gantry trembled under the Terminator's massed fire. A warning rune on its support post flickered maintenance overdue in a glyph. Even Don could read. Hey buddy, he muttered at the post. Time to be overdue on purpose. He slid a palm-sized device from his belt. His own work, nothing warpish about it. Just a clamp, an induction coil and a toggle. He locked it to the support and breathed out. Below, the Terminator surged, shouldering aside lesser daemons. A bolt shell hit the gantry and ricocheted. Metal screamed. Don thumbed the toggle. The coil dumped 3 seconds of hoarded charge into the post. Not enough to cut. Enough to weaken the weld with a heat spike precisely where rust had already done half the job. Don slammed his staff into the joint. The gantry tore free like a page. It fell as the Terminator looked up. Don rode it down just long enough to kick off. The slab of metal smashed into corrupted ceramite like a falling door. The Terminator went to a knee in the clatter and sparks. Now, Tavares said, Kraken penetrators found joints. The Terminator's helm snapped sideways. A second volley walked into its gorget. The giant toppled. Behind it, a new tide pressed. More bloodletters, a Heltalon-scented wind that did not belong indoors. Reality going soft at the edges. Seal, Vex barked. Seal, seal, can't. A deckhand croaked over Vox. Voice chewed by static. Pressure wrong. The door won't remember shut. Make it, Vex spat, and then to Don. You said you could keep the relay from cascading. Keep it. Don didn't argue. He dropped to a knee by the ward panel. The third relay, the tired one he'd called earlier, was already whining. Thermal stress lines spidered across its ceramic body like ice on a windshield. He popped the cover, felt the heat on his knuckles, and forced his hands into the space where a sane man would not. Give me 30 seconds, he grunted. 10, Tavares said, and then he was there. A wall of cobalt braced over Don without looking back. Shield up, bolter barking disciplined bursts. 2 Marines to either side locked into a living bulwark, their steps in time with his. Don shunted load off the relay by cross-tying 2 sacrificial resistors in series with a length of copper braid. He'd stripped from a lumen 2 corridors back. Ugly, effective. The pitch smooth dipped, then rose 1 clean note. Do it, he said. Vex's tendrils stabbed 3 controls in a pattern that made no human sense. The hexagram brightened. The door's edges glowed. The seam that had been a smile remembered how to be a scar. The last bloodletter in the gap stared in animal confusion as the universe withdrew its permission. Then it was simply not. Silence wasn't silence. It was the after-ringing of bolts, the thin wheeze of cooling metal, the soft, wrong air that remained when a breach survived. Damage control, Tavares said, as if he weren't standing ankle-deep in Damon ash. Purge, redline the ward, next grid. They did this 3 more times in as many corridors. Once, a Daemon engine's tendrils came through a floor grate like a patient spider's fingers, and Don leaped back as a power sword sheared them off, and they flopped like butchered eels. Once, the Psycho woman stood in a doorway with both hands out and sang, and the air rippled and something invisible howled like a child, told a different story, and went away. At the third breach, a trio of rubric Marines filed through in gold and cobalt without hurry, their hollow helms turning as if the emptiness within were interested. Their bolters spoke a slow, polite dialect of death. Don could feel the hum in their armor. Not tech, not life. A holding pattern. Smoke, Don hissed. Denied, Maru snapped. No line of sight, no kill. Not for them, for their eyes. Don peeled 2 squat cylinders from a pouch, thumbed both, and rolled them along opposite walls. They popped with a flash that wasn't light so much as wrong. Lumen spectrum laced with ward frequencies he'd sampled from the Sanctum panel. The rubric's lenses flickered. Their aim lagged an instant. An instant was enough for Ultramarines. Kraken rounds found seams. The rubrics came apart like statuary. Catalog that effect, Vex said, almost tender. Don nodded, already swapping the cylinder's cores for fresh caps and filing what he'd felt under works once, not forever. They fought to a rhythm. Breach, brace, tweak the hymn, purge, plug the machine back into itself. The ship held, men died. The Dominus Lux bled incense and oil, and hope, and did not break, not here. Bridge, Vox cut in. This time the captain of the ship himself, voice ironed flat. All hands, prepare to scuttle hangar lattice. Enemy massing in Bay Primus. Captain Tavares, you will extract to launch galleries now. Inquisitor, Tavares asked, not looking at Karas. Karas's gaze was a calculation meant for other rooms. For a long second, he stood in denial's posture. Then he inclined his head once. The Lux is lost. Tavares didn't blink. All squads, he said, fall back by files. Sanctum last. Bring them with us. Don looked at the ward petals, and then at the way the corridor lights pulsed, and he understood something in the bones of the ship. This cathedral was going to be a coffin. He tightened his grip on his staff, found the beat of Marine boots moving out, and fell into step. He had not punched a hole in reality to die in someone else's. He would not let 1,000 men die, because he couldn't keep time. They ran toward the launches as the ship sang, and the warp pressed its face to the glass and smiled. The launch galleries of the Dominus Lux were cathedrals turned inside out, nave lines stretched toward the stars.
Doors the size of cathedrals' facades breathing void. Rows of Thunderhawk gunships hunched on mag clamps like hunting birds turned to steel prayers. Mechanicus rights hung from rafters in ribboned wax. Incense wagons lay overturned, their smoke smeared into oily halos by pressure shifts. Board, Captain Tavares ordered, his voice filling the gallery like a final amen. Squad Primus, with me. Secundus on flank. Tertius, rear guard. Inquisitor, your retinue. Carus needed no more permission. He was in motion even before the last consonant. Acolytes in his wake. Psyche stumbling and still seeing too far. Dominus Vex peeled away to an open panel set into the wall, his tendrils burying themselves in sockets and blessing ports as if kissing lovers goodbye. Give me 1 minute, Vex said. Hanger lattice will hold if I tell it one last story. You have 30 seconds, Tavares said. Donatello hit the Thunderhawk's ramp at a dead run, then stopped at the lip. Beyond, the gallery doors were cracked open, a mist of atomized ice glittering in the Out there, reality was thin. Out there, Helldrakes wheeled like vultures that knew a feast was coming and wanted to witness the carving. Bolts of warp fire unspooled from their maws and curled back on themselves like thoughts you shouldn't have. Close that, Don said. It's what I'm doing. Vex muttered from the wall. Stop watching me and find something to be useful with. Don scanned the Thunderhawk's nose. 40 meters of brutal angles. Rotary cannons underslung like statements. Auspex arrays bolted on like afterthought. A turret blister along the dorsal line with a command cradle. The dorsal hatch was unlocked. Either disdain or faith. Captain Don called. Permission to man your top can. Tavares glanced up the ramp, helm tilting a fraction. Can you hit a flying daemon in a hurricane inside a church? I can make your gun think like a metronome. Don said. Do it, Tavares said. Brother Agammon. Get her hot. The pilot, Agammon, broad-shouldered even for an Astartes, scar carved into his helm where a Melterburn had kissed, snapped runes with gauntlet fingers, and spoke to the Thunderhawk as if it were a stubborn horse. Engines whined. Grav plates hummed. A relic badge on the center console vibrated as if in sympathy. Don climbed into the dorsal cupola and dropped into the cradle. The heavy stubber here was no toy. It was the kind of weapon that made atmosphere itself lean away. The sighting auspex flickered static, and the whining ghost of a prayer. He popped the panel on the back of the housing and swore under his breath. The targeting logic was good, old and out of tune with this much warp noise. I'm going to cheat, Don told the machine. He pulled a cable from his pack, mated an adapter he'd carved out of jealousy and junk, and jacked into the feed. Lines of numbers spun on a tiny repeater in his peripheral. The Auspex's sampling window widened obediently. Dominus Lux to all craft, the ship's master intoned over Vox. Formal even now. The Emperor receives our dead. The Lux burns in his name. Go. In the same breath, the hangar lattice groaned and broke. It didn't explode. It peeled. Petals of void shield folded like a flower, remembering how to die. Field lines unspooling in a halo. Vacuum took what it wanted, hard and quick. Men who weren't anchored found a different horizon. Don's stomach clutched, and then remembered how to be a stomach as the Thunderhawk's grav plates bit. Helldrake's dove. Their bodies were blasphemies of design, skin and iron, agreeing to be like this together. Wings a geometry that wrote knives in air. One rolled with obscene grace and painted an arc of warp flame across the gallery mouth. It struck the Thunderhawk 2 berths down. Ceramite glowed, and the gunship screamed. Up, Tavares said. Agammon didn't ask about safe lanes or traffic. He slammed throttles and lifted on a knife edge, skimming the gallery ceiling, scraping halos off incense smoke. Don's cupola sang as the Thunderhawk cleared the mouth, and the void drank the sound away. Targets, Agammon said. I see them, Don hissed, and he did. He had widened the sampling window enough to filter warp stutter. He had weighted the logic toward repeaters, the micro flutter of wing joints, the spectral signature of engines rather than fire. The sight settled onto a Helldrake angling in from above and left. He led it by a slice of arc, learned on rooftops and in alleys, and in video games, before those things had become indistinguishable from his hands. He pressed the trigger. The stubber vomited a storm. The Helldrake folded its wing in a laughable nod to physics, and slid under the stream. Don didn't track the body, he tracked the error in its path. The tiny catch on the left, downbeat where iron, remembered weight. He tapped 2 quick bursts where it would have to be, if it wanted to be anything. The rounds met hinge. The wing made a torn banner sound. The Helldrake tumbled, shearing past the Thunderhawk so close, Don could have reached out and touched corruption. Second, Gammon said. No praise, no panic. Right, Don said, already swinging. The next creature climbed through the debris, like a thought that refused to stay buried. Don threw 2 bursts near its jaw, not to kill, to make it blink. It blinked the way predators blink, forward, and that brought it into the line of the Thunderhawk's undernose cannon. Brother Morrow, riding the ramp gun, burned its face off with a scroll of mass reactive argument. Third, Gammon said, rolling to keep a dorsal spar between the Thunderhawk and a gout of flensing fire. I don't have him, Don said, scanning. Warp flame 8 angles and returns. The Auspex complained in a dialect he was learning too quickly. Give me a yaw. Gammon twitched the stick a degree. Space repositioned. The third, Helldrake burst into Don's window on a line that meant to cut them in half. Down, Don said on reflex. Gammon dumped a handful of altitude. The Helldrake missed the cupola by the space of Don's bandana knot, and its tail scythed past like a meat slicer. Don braced, then turned his bursts into the triangles the tail had to right to turn. 2 seconds of fire later, a plume of corruption trailed. A second after that, the creature's rear half forgot the plan. Backwash, Gammon warned. The Thunderhawk kicked as the dying Daemon engines washed across graph plates. Don's teeth clicked. Something hot sliced the edge of his bandana and the top layer of his shell. He smelled himself a little, a roasted nut smell with ash. He kept firing until there wasn't a target, and then stopped because ammunition would matter later. Lanes, Tavares asked from the troop bay. Dirty, Gammon said. Clear enough, if they don't decide to want us more. They want us sufficiently, the Psyker whispered, and Dawn didn't ask whether she meant us or him. The Thunderhawk broke into cleaner void, beyond the wheeling carnival of the Lux's death. Dawn risked a look back. What he saw redefined loss. The battle barge shed fire in slow coils, a saint's hair cut and burned in a right. Hull sections peeled with terrible grace. In the umbral light, a despoiler-class silhouette bloomed like a continent coming to kill you. Set course for the nearest Imperial beacon, Karas said sharply. We return to Catian Primaris. The chapter must be warned. Confirmed, Gammon said. Calf, the Vox began, and then Don's Auspex yelled. Contact on R6. Fast, too fast. Helldrakes, Tavares asked. Not 3, Don said, peering. The returns were thin bright, not fast, skipping across sampling windows like stones. 12, no break. Gammon didn't need the word. The Thunderhawk fell into a long sickening dive, and left itself behind. Tracers stitched where it had been. Warp fire drew hieroglyphs in the dark. Don didn't try to track 12. He tracked 1, and then the place where that one would lead a less patient beast. He laid bursts into the meeting place, and watched something die surprised. He couldn't do that 11 more times. Options, he snapped down Vox to Vex. Do not insult me by saying faster, Vex replied dryly. The Thunderhawk is a hammer. We are being pestered by needles. Then make me a magnet, Don said. There were 5 heartbeats pause as a man fused to machines, did arithmetic. No other man could do so quickly. Top relay, dorsal bus, Vex said. Pulse it at your convenience. Don reached behind the cupola and flipped a guarded cover. The toggle beneath was ugly and stern and promised to hurt him more than the machine. He thumped it, every lumen within the Thunderhawk dimmed, and then popped back to brilliance at a new phase. Outside, the space around the gunship warbled like heat. The Helldrake's return skittered. 2 missed a beat and slid. A third yawed into an angle that brought it across Don's arc like a duck through a county fair. He clipped it, without art. The others adjusted with horrible grace. It won't work twice, Don said. Nothing does, Vex said. Once is enough. It was. This time, the swarm passed through the pulser's ghost and recovered. The Thunderhawk's vector finally diverged enough that they chose a different meal. The dying body of the Dominus Lux, large and holy, and full of prayers to ruin. Don exhaled and let his head bang once against the cushion behind him. Blood ticked down his temple under the bandana line and drew a pink line along the edge of his beak. Status, Tavares said. Alive, Ganon said. For now will do, Tavares said. Make for Cadian. Don wiped his temple with the back of his hand and watched the wreck of a cathedral fall into a hungry night. He didn't have a word for the feeling in his throat. He had a city's worth of dead in his history, the names of 1,000 alleys, and still this was different. He watched until the Vox cut a new channel and spoke a new war into being. Cadian Primaris rose from the void, like a fortress that had decided to be a planet. Its orbital bastions bloomed with defense grids. Its docking spires stacked up through a thin scud of artificial weather. The Thunderhawk came in under the guns, Vox squawking authorization codes in a dialect of reverence. Saturnine voices queried, sterner voices granted. On the landing dais of platform Delta 7, an honor guard in cobalt and gold stood as if carved overnight by a tireless sculptor. Servo skulls bobbed with recorder's hunger. Banners hung motionless in still air thick with incense. Donatello's boots touched the deck and sent a minor scandal whispering through clusters of chapter serfs. He caught fragments, Xenos, relic, blasphemy, miracle. It was interesting to be all four at once. Captain Tavares took 3 steps forward, helm depolarizing enough to show a human jaw like a breaking wave. He saluted in a motion that was also a threat. The honor guard parted. Chief Librarian Tigurius waited beyond, cowl humming with restrained power, gaze like a scalpel and a blessing. I have foreseen your arrival, Tigurius said without drama. It was obscured by turbulence, and something I lack words for. I can supply several, Inquisitor Draven Karras interjected, sweeping forward on the authority of someone who had never learned to ask. Heresy, threat, opportunity, all demand audience. Then you shall have it, came a voice that made the deck feel small. Marnius Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, walked into view with the weight of a codex in his step. His armor made the idea of ornate feel underdressed. Every aquila on his frame seemed sharper than belief. Beside him stood Lord Inquisitor Shia Vos of the Ordo Malleus. Power armor, a different design. The cold gaze of a woman who had traded a decade of sleep for a single clear thought. Report, Calgar said, and the world reorganized itself to obey. Tavares told the story like a ledger. Anomaly, containment, breach, borders, withdrawal under fire. The death of the Dominus Lux. He didn't embroider. He didn't excuse. He didn't say we were lucky. He didn't say we were damned. He just said what happened, and the air tried to not make it poetry. Calgar listened without moving. Tigurius watched Don's face when the captain spoke of ward harmonics, and of the relay that had been tired, and of the way the hymn had been shifted ahead of malice. Vos watched everyone, and the outsider, Calgar said finally, tone neither warm nor cold. What are you? Donatello, Don said, because anything else was somebody else's answer. Engineer, fighter, lost, you shine, Vos said, voice very flat, like a beacon in the Imperium. Yet the taint I expect need to see, I do not see. Explain. I can't, Don said, and that was the truth. Your warp isn't my medium. My head runs on batteries, not candles. Tigurius's mouth almost smiled. A novel catechism. His mind is quiet, murmured the psyker from the Thunderhawk. Steadier now, eyes not bleeding. Not because it is empty, because it orders itself. Containment or collaboration? Vos asked without inflection. Both, Calgar said. We do not get to have perfect choices. The Black Legion moved a fleet to catch him. We must presume others will do the same. We hold him, and we use him. Dawn breathed out through his nose. I'll help you fight the things that tore that ship, he said, nodding skyward, where ghost wreckage still glittered in the high black. I won't be a trophy or a tool you point at your rivals. I won't teach you to break your own world faster. Good, Voss said, which was unnerving, because we broke it sufficiently already. Calgar turned, the movement like the wheeling of a bastion. Walk. The stratagem was a cathedral of intent. A hololithic table at its heart displayed the sector and its scars. Red pinpricks proliferated as astropaths pushed whispers through the warp and bled for it. The room smelled like oil and wax and the hard edge of duty. Their response was immediate, Tigirius said, fingertips hovering over light. Warp phenomena recorded across the Ultima segment in minutes after the locks burned. The signatures are mixed. Death Guard moving from the Galactic north, World Eaters to the south, Emperor's children to the east, and the Thousand Suns. His gaze cut to dawn. They come directly. Not a crusade, Voss said. A race. For him, Calgar said. No drama or line. For whatever he represents. For the idea that a thing can fall into their game that isn't of their rules. Dawn folded his arms. He did not like being the center of strategy discussions. In his world, the center was a pizza, and he was happiest cutting it into equal slices for those who bled to buy it. What's the plan? He asked. Calgar didn't smile. You will not leave this fortress without escort. You will not touch anything that glows without permission. You will be fed, housed and watched. In return, you will tell Dominus Vex everything you can safely say about the way your machines hum, so that he may hum back and perhaps make a path home you can survive. Also, Voss said, and if Calgar was stone, she was razor. You will help us hunt. The Imperium does not only defend, it denies. Targets, Tavares asked. Tigirius widened the map on a gesture. The display centered on an industrial world swaddled in red light. Vorels, manufacturing spires reached like organ pipes into a dirty atmosphere. Their orbital defense ring glittered like a saint's circlet. Forge world, Tigirius said. Vital. The Thousand Suns will reach it in 3 days. Or one. Or now, if they decide to teach our clocks another arithmetic. Calgar set both gauntlets on the table. The hololith lit the edges like anointing. We will split our attention, not our soul. 2nd and 7th companies moved to check Mortarian's filth and Angron's butcher's work. The Ordo Malleus dispatches Grey Knights to corral the Emperor's children. You, his gaze pinned Dawn with a general's gentleness. Go with Captain Tavares to Vorels. Deny Magnus his prize. Dawn's chest tightened at the name, though all he had was a shape and a tutorial dueling him through a wall. I'm not a weapon that hurts a god. No one is, Tigirius said. We aim not to kill Magnus. We aim to spoil him. That I can do, Dawn said softly. Good, Calgar said. Eat, then on. You depart within the hour. Dawn glanced at Tavares, at Vex, at the Psyker, at Taurus, who looked like a man who'd been denied a favorite kind of sin. He felt very small inside a cathedral meant to make warriors feel large. Do you have a place, he asked, where a person can hit something that hits back without ruining your roof? Tigirius nodded once. We call it a practice hall. I suspect you will call it home for a very short time. It was not a meeting, because meetings have rooms. It was a shift in temperature along an ocean made of thought, a turn of heads that were also storms, a quartet of attentions focusing because something new had tapped the glass and left a fingerprint none of them had seen. In the brass citadel, the throne of skulls adjusted its weight for a owner made of rage. Rivers of blood inverted their flow and poured upward as Korn learned the syllable of a new challenge and smiled without lips. In a palace built of skin and sensation, 100,000 instruments tuned themselves to a frequency they had not felt. Slaanesh tasted a boredom that did not come from abstinence but from victory without effort, and shuddered with desire to break it into a scream. In a garden where Rod learned hymns, flowers burst and reknitted in their own passes. Noble sniffed a resilience that wasn't denial, and wondered how it would look in a jar, labeled, loved. In an impossible library, towers of books rearranged themselves to spell a joke only the teller understood. Pages tore in elaborate ways that left more words than they began with. Singe laughed like paper being cut and folded. They were not friends. They were a game you cannot quit. But for the length of an intake of breath, they leaned in the same direction toward a small green shape whose mind did not leak into their sea. The ripple crossed the warp and became bruised color storms on a dozen worlds. It became cultists waking with nosebleeds and new prayers. It became Daemon engines stalling mid-roar as their pilots lost the line of the song. It became sorcerers staring into bowls of mercury and seeing not reflections but a shadow with a bandana like a purple flag and a stick divided into simple machines. On Cation Primaris, in a refectory with vaulted ceilings and trestles made for giants, Donatello and Tavares sat with a mountain of nutrient bricks between them. The bricks tasted like ambition and chalk. Don chewed respectfully anyway. Chapter serfs passed with trays, and the holy fear of seeing their saints sit down. Your rationing is efficient, Don said around a mouthful. It feeds men who do not need pleasure to kill, Tavares said, tearing a brick as easily as he tore a heretic. But we will find you fruit. I won't say no to fruit, Don said, a little wistful. Or pizza. Pizza, Tavares repeated as if cataloguing another Sinius. Dominus Vex arrived with a handheld cogitator and a look that meant he would not sleep for 3 days, and wanted to thank it. Your frequencies, he said, for the ward interference. Show me. Don wiped nutrient paste on a napkin and flipped it to the small stylus clipped under his bandana. He sketched in the corner of Vex's screen 3 simple waveforms, and how he'd staggered them. Vex made a noise Don had only heard once before, when a lab friend had discovered that a junkyard transistor was actually a lost gold contact. Good, Vex said, pitying perhaps every man he would speak to today, who would not understand why it was. Do you know how much trouble you are? About this much, Don said, holding thumb and forefinger an inch apart, and rising. A novice serf hovered at the edge of their table, eyes wide. Tavares looked up. The boy flinched. Speak, Tavares said. Chief Librarian requests your presence in the Librarius, my lord. The boy stammered, and the outsiders if it pleases. It rarely does, Tavares said, standing. Come. The Librarius was not a library. It was an engine room for minds. Warded crystals lined alcoves. The air prickled like winter light. Tigurius stood in a circle of junior librarians, their eyes hooded by discipline and pain. Watch, he said. The whole is above the dais lit with the sector and then painted it with wounds. Red points bloomed like a conversion chart for despair. Each was labeled in texts ancient and new. Fratris 7, Galian Reach, Voralius Paul. Simultaneous incursions, Tigurius said. Not one crusade, 4 hunts. Magnus comes to Vorus. He is not alone. Mortarion to the north, an aid recited. Angron south, Fulgrim east. We cannot answer all, Tavares said. Quiet rage, a steel undernote. We do not, Kalga said, entering like the answer to the question the room was afraid to ask. We answer the one that matters most now. The rest we contain until we can afford to burn.
Voralus, Tigurius said. 3 days by our clocks, an hour by ill will. Don leaned in. On the display he watched orbital platforms flower into hot dust. He saw symbols that meant nothing to him, sequence into a story, shields failing at the poles first, lines of teleportation tearing down into the basilicas, names of manufactoria that were also saints. Up we go, Tavares said, looking at Calgar. Not a question. You go, Calgar said. He flicked a glance to Don. You go with. Understood, Don said. His mouth was dry. He thought of his brothers, of a rat who had taught him to use a staff, of a city where a rooftop could be a refuge. He thought of a basilica filled with machines that were also prayers. Provisions, Voss said, not unkindly. You will wear what we give you. You will carry what we tell you. You will not improvise with warp. Noted, Don said. I improvise with physics. See that you only do, Voss said, and something like a smile cut the edge of her mouth. The warp improvises back. The briefing wound on kill zones plotted. Vox call signs assigned. Fail safes defined. The spear of Macragh would cut the warp with them aboard. They would drop to Voralus, on a covert vector, find the Basilica Mechanicum, and ruin whatever Magnus had come to adore. When it ended, Don walked with Tavares into a hall where statuary watched like the memory of better days. "Captain," he said, picking his words, "I don't know how long I'm here. I don't know if my team knows I fell. I don't know if I can get back." "You will try," Tavares said. "I will," Don said. "On the way I'll try to keep your people breathing." Tavares looked at him steadily. "Do that," he said, "and we will be brothers long enough to deserve the word." They clasped forearm to forearm, iron to callus. For a moment, the galaxy looked like a thing with a seam in it you could pry, if you were careful and strong, and didn't mind bleeding. Outside, a god of change learned a new word. No. The spear of Macragh cut the warp like a blade that had been sharpened on monks' tongues. In its training deck, 4 hangars knocked into one, and floored with shock-absorbing mesh. Donatello stood across from a mountain in cobalt, and learned the limits of his muscles in a world that made mountains move. "Begin," said brother librarian Lexicus, standing off to the side with a slate and the skepticism of a man who had seen faith kill less than physics. The ultramarine opposite Don was named Phocion, and he moved like the horizon deciding to show you what it could do. He came in clean, as if demonstrating a point he had not yet decided to make sharp. Don slipped under the first probing jab, turned his staff across Phocion's wrist, and felt the gauntlet shudder. "Good leverage," Lexicus murmured, making a small mark, assisted by simple machines. "Elegant. Human scale." Don puffed, disengaging, pivoting, and whacking the marine's pauldron where a seam sat like an invitation. "I'm not dropping a Titan." "You are not," Tavares said dryly from the edge of the mat. They circled. Don stayed in the marine's pocket where a bolter was more liability than lesson. He counted breaths. He thought of footwork patterns that had kept him alive in tunnels and on rooftops. He tagged Phocion's hip and drew out a weight shift that would become a fall in 3 beats if the marine were someone else. He was not. He rebalanced with the contempt eternity has for gravity. "Again," Lexicus said. They did it until sweat slicked the edge of Don's bandana, and the muscles under his shell burned a steady caution. He learned how much he could ask of his bow's spring before the staff would ask back. He learned that marine armor relented here, and never there. He learned that his hands didn't shake even when a fist the size of his head passed through the space where he had been a breath ago. "Enough," Tavares said, when the warning runes on the panel flashed to suggest the deck was bored of not breaking. "We can serve ourselves for enemies that are not friends." Don bowed to Phocion. The marine returned it with a dip of helm that might have been respect or the acknowledgement of an interesting insect. After, they walked the practice hall. Dominus Vex had opened a back room for Don. Racks of sanctioned tools, a bench, a small shrine to the machine god, whose eyes Don pretended not to feel. "You will want to tune your toys," Vex said, gesturing to a spread of signal generators and phase bridges. "You will not want to change my ship." "I am only going to change your ship," Don said brightly, then raised both hands at Vex's glare. "Kidding. Mostly. I'll make small things that make big things hum less ugly." He got to work. He tuned the 2 cylindrical grenades he'd used in the Lux's guts, tweaking their lumen spectrum output to better flirt with rubric lensing. He built a portable phase tickler, a thumb-sized emitter that could adjust a ward's 3rd harmonic without the Sanctum's console. He carved grapnel spikes to throw into factory ceilings. He stitched a new strap for his bow, tested its flex, rubbed oil into its grain. Time in warp is not time. It unspools into knots, long stretches of unbroken work punctuated by instants that taste like deja vu and copper. Don found his rhythm in it the way he found rhythm on rooftops. He ate. He slept 2 hours at a time. He woke with the ship's hymn in his bones and the memory of a library with books that could not be read without changing the reader. On the 2nd cycle, Tigurius arrived at the bench and watched Don work without speaking for a minute. Then, "Do you fear them, the gods?" Don asked. "They're priests," Tigurius said softly. "Men who are no longer men, who wear dust and call it piety. Fear's not useful for what I have to do in the next 24 hours. Don said, not looking up. "I respect the scale. I plan. I don't stand still." "You will make a poor sacrifice," Tigurius said, half to himself.
and left with a look that was almost satisfaction. In the refectory again, Tavares found him gnawing a fruit that a serf had produced with the zeal of a man extracting a relic from storage. It was tart and honest. "We will have no room for sparring on Voralus," Tavares said without preamble. "You will move with us until you cannot. You will not be alone." "I'm never alone," Don said. "I've got 1,000 engineers who never met me standing behind my eyes, telling me this bolt is wrong and that joint is noisy. I would have liked to meet them," Tavares said. "You'd have liked some," Don said. "Others would have driven you mad, and then sold you the cure." Tavares's vox clicked in his jaw as a call came in. He listened, eyes hardening. "Translate in 5, he said. "Get your rest if you can. And your rope." "My rope?" Don asked. "You throw grapnels like a man who trusts rope," Tavares said. "Trust it more." Don slept like a man with a deadline. Shallow, efficient, without dreams he could afford to remember. He woke to the spear's engines changing pitch and to Igamon's voice on internal Vox calling stations. The world became straight lines. The ship shivered. The Geller field sighed like someone stepping into a cold shower. "Real space in 30 came the bridge. All hands." Don checked the buckles on his harness. He patted the bow as if it were alive. He tucked the phase tickler into a pouch and whispered at it to behave. It hummed like a cricket. When the shutters in the spear's bridge retracted, Voralus filled the void with industry and fire. The Forge world was a planet-sized machine in the act of being murdered. From orbit, Voralus was a drumhead struck by too many sticks at once. Its defense platforms were half ghosts, wrecks spinning slow cartwheels while blue and violet fires ate them like shipyards burned in silence. The flames made no sense, and therefore the most sense. "Augur," Igamon said. "Clear space is a lie," the Augur officer replied. "But I have holes. Biggest lies near the poles. Basilica Mechanicum shows active defenses. Weak, multiple teleportation signatures. Everywhere. Everywhere is not a coordinate," Tavares said. "It is the best I have," the Augur officer said, and nobody killed him for saying truth instead of comfort. Groundside Vox was a graveyard of voices. Skitari code canned, clipped, precise. One arm gone. Continue advance. Tech priests reciting emergency rites through broken Vox grills. Civilians screaming only on the edges. The bulk of the world was machine and machine's priests. Direct assault and we get clipped out of the sky, Igamon said, as 4 new bright tongues licked the upper atmosphere. Covert insertion, Tavares said. He turned his helm just enough to meet Don's gaze. "You said your eyes read machines. I read habits," Don said. "Machines have them. People have them. Cities have them. Put me over the Basilica's north quarter. Look for maintenance access where nobody who can make a speech thinks about walking." "Don," Igamon said, and the spear of Macrag's drop bay came alive, with the noise of harnesses, weapon checks and prayers. They didn't teleport. They did it the way men have always done it, with a fast bird and a lower ceiling, and a wish to be somewhere else more than the air wanted them to be where they were. The Thunderhawk bucked through interdiction fire that looked like lightning learning new verbs. Rubric Marines appeared in courtyards below with the slowness of bad memories. Exalted sorcerers traced burning ciphers in the air, and caused cover to become paintings of different rooms. "Here," Don said, into the pilot's ear over a shared line, stabbing a finger at a slit of darkness against the Basilica's flank. It was nothing. A shadow where 2 buttresses met. To a man who liked stairs you weren't supposed to know. It was a front door. "Hold," Igamon said. The Thunderhawk didn't hold. It flared, kissed the buttress with one skid for the space of an inhalation, and yanked up again. In that inhalation, Tavares, Don, Brother Lexicus, Apothecary Milos, Tech Marine Drouse, and 14 more were not in the Thunderhawk. They were running into a shadow, and praying the shadow wouldn't decide to be more honest. The maintenance hatch was a square of functional ugliness, with a keypad like a coffin's mouth. Drouse jammed a mechadendrite into its throat, and whispered fast benedictions with the breath of a man who didn't mind getting shocked. Sparks spat. The hatch remembered how to obey. Inside smelled like cold oil, and the kind of dust that falls when machines have been allowed to work for centuries. The passage sloped down into a choked red glow. This route runs to secondary reaction stacks, Dross said. From there, access to central forge. Move, Tavares said. Pairs, watch roofs. They moved. The maintenance ways were arteries wrapped around organs of industry. Conduit banks ran like ribs. Occasionally the walls bulged in ways that said warp had put its thumb under the skin and pushed. Don touched the bulge once with the back of his knuckles, felt the wrong temperature, and didn't do that again. Distant gunfire rolled like weather in a city. Screams came less and orders more, the way they do, where soldiers outnumber civilians. Don listened between the sounds for the music of the invaders. The Thousand Suns didn't sing with their mouths. Their presence was a line of coal under the hum of a world doing its best to survive its gods. At an intersection, Lexicus raised a hand. Halt. 3 seconds later, a squad of Skitarii Rangers jogged across the passage ahead, their long coats stiff with filth, their rifles kept as clean as law. They didn't startle. They didn't stop. One turned his head enough for a red glass eye to note the Ultramarines and the green thing with a stick, and made a series of clicks that translated to honor. Acknowledged. Continue mission. Efficient, Don murmured. Holy, Dross corrected. The passage kinked and became a gallery above a fabrication chamber, the size of a ship's hangar. Below, assembly lines lay in suspended sentences. Machines still held half-made barrels and housings like arrested words. At the far end, a rubric phalanx advanced with mindless patience, their bolters rephrasing the argument of mass. Behind them drifted 2 exalted sorcerers on discs, their staffs cutting sigils into the air that dripped down to pool in reality like spilled ink. Between those and the Ultramarines, a knot of Skitarii and tech thralls held a line behind overturned carts. They were dying with clockwork grace, one by one, as if following a plan that had been written into them when their blood was replaced. Fire lines, Tavares said. Brother Lexicus, your counter-chant. Don, I'm on lights, Don said. He slid along the gallery rail, popped a service panel, and found the chamber's lumen control. Rude, old, honest. He jacked his phase tickler into the bus and tuned in 3 quick motions he would have called instinct if he wanted to lie about the years that had put them there. He didn't blind the room. He wouldn't blind Marines to give himself a trick. He shifted the lumen spectrum half a degree toward the ward frequencies he'd sampled in the Luxus sanctum. Rubric lenses didn't fog. They hesitated. Their bolter cadence lagged by the space of a breath. Now, Tavares said, and the line of Ultramarines poured disciplined hate into the hesitation. On the floor, Dross kicked a control on a servo loader, stole its heart with a cable, and asked it to be an EM grenade for a second. It obliged, screaming, and the nearest sorcerer's disc juddered. He dipped as physics collected a dead sorcery had tried to write off. Lexicus spoke, not an oration but a counterpoint, and a glyph at the end of the sorcerer's staff lost a stroke and meant something else. The bolt train that should have turned a Skitarius into a fresco splashed in the air, like rain hitting heat. Don watched the pattern shift and snapped a grapnel into the girder above the second sorcerer. He didn't try to drag a god priest. He knocked a brace into the disc's path at the exact moment its pilot decided to skim under a crane arm. The clang as it struck sang in his molars. The sorcerer tumbled. Tavares's next volley bracketed him. They took the chamber like you take a breath, after running too long, ugly, grateful, not completely. Survivors of the work crew rose in jerks, their augment lungs wheezing praise to the Omnissiah. Report, Tavares said. Basilica's inner sanctum is compromised, as Skitarius said, voice flat with more metal than meat. Magnus advances. The name was a pressure drop in the room. Lexicus's eyes narrowed. Dross's mechadendrites shivered. Rude, Tavares said. Through central forge, the Skitarius said. Through heat. Don glanced down his makeshift kit, then at the central gantries that would take them through the hall, where machines forged the machines that made guns. Heat was fine. Heat was honest. Captain, he said, and when Tavares Tavares looked. He didn't talk about gods. He talked about stairs. Go, Tavares said. They ran into a basilica that was a furnace and a puzzle and a prayer, and somewhere deep within it, a being with one eye and too many plans turned his head to listen to the new rhythm in his world, and smiled a scholar's smile. He had come to study a pattern. He had found a person, and persons break experiments.